watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture.
I'm Mark Golub. One of the things we enjoy doing most is introducing you to the outstanding rabbinic minds on the world Jewish scene. And today we have a very special guest to introduce you to. He is a gentleman who has not only served virtually 50 years in the American rabbinate as a conservative rabbi in Natick, Massachusetts, where he is now Rabbi Laureate at Temple Israel in Natick, Massachusetts. But he has also become one of the most prolific and profound rabbinic writers on the American Jewish scene. And when I mention the book that he has written, virtually all of you will either know the book or you'll have read the book yourself. My guest has written the book When Bad Things Happen to Good People, which he wrote in 1981, published by Shulchan Books. And I'm speaking, of course, about Rabbi Harold Kushner, who is gracious enough to join us here in the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And we thank them for giving us an opportunity to speak to him. Harold, thank you so much for joining us.
It was worth it just to hear you say all those nice things about me, Mark.
Well, I haven't even begun. And I want you to know, I spoke to Harold for a few moments before we began, and I said to him that he is one of my heroes. He is, you know, in the trade there is something called a rabbi's rabbi. And Harold, that's what you've become. In very many ways, you represent the finest of what rabbis are meant to be. And so it's an honor to sit with you at all, and I thank you very, very much. You were kind enough to say that I could begin by talking about your first book. And again, so many people know of the book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And I know some of the background, and it really came out of some personal experience you had, a tragic experience that you and your wife Suzette had with a son. Can I first ask you to just sort of summarize for us what it was that prompted you not only to write the book, but it didn't happen right away. It wasn't something that you did instantly. But I had the feeling from some of the things I've read about you, over time you came to understand it was a book you had to write. But would you tell our audience something about the background of that book?
I had to write it for two reasons. My wife and I had a child who died at the age of 14 of one of the rarest diseases in the world. It's called progeria, the rapid aging syndrome. It meant that when he was 3 years old, he stopped growing and started growing old. And he developed all the ailments of old age. His hair fell out. He grew very thin. He had no subcutaneous fat. He couldn't put on weight. And we were warned, it was diagnosed when he was 3 years old, that he wouldn't live beyond his early teens. I had 11 years to come to terms with the fact that he would die young. And it just hurt so much, not only personally, this was our child and a wonderful boy, it hurt religiously and theologically. The world isn't supposed to work like that. We were probably the most observant, the most Jewishly committed family in town. And yet this was happening to our son and not anybody else's family.
This is Aaron.
Aaron, that's right.
Okay. Was he your firstborn? Because I know you have a daughter as well.
He was our first child. For the first few months, he thrived as a normal child. And then when he was about 8 months old, his pediatrician noticed he was not putting on weight. The skin was a little bit mottled. And there was something about him. This was an old, experienced hand, the pediatrician. Something about him didn't strike him as right. Mm-hmm. So we had a number of tests run, got all sorts of diagnoses which turned out to be incorrect. And then as he got older and some of the external symptoms started to manifest themselves, most of the doctors with whom we dealt had never seen a child with progeria before. They'd only read about it in textbooks. But his hair fell out. He wasn't growing, wasn't putting on weight. And they diagnosed it.
He lived to be 14?
That's right.
Did he understand what was happening to him?
He knew he was smaller and looked different than other children. But the smartest thing we did was treat him like a normal child, love him without limits, so he had that confidence that he could be stared at and say, well, there's something wrong with those people. I'm okay. Mm-hmm. It helped that he was extremely bright, very funny, very feisty. You couldn't get the better of him.
Really?
And that nourished him through till he got to the threshold of adolescence, and when his friends started getting into boy-girl stuff and he was just left out of that hurt. When he was about 13 and a half years old, as the doctors predicted, the progeria started to affect his heart, And at that point, despite the fact that his father was a prominent theologian, it was my wife who sat down and told him that this was a fatal illness. And it was hard for him and hard for us. But when we heard the diagnosis at age 3, it just ran counter to everything I'd been taught about God and about the way the world works at seminary.
How so?
That God controls the world, that if something happens which doesn't seem right, God has his reasons for it. And it's our limitation that we can't understand why this is part of God's plan. The limitation is not with God.
And is this what you were taught at JTS?
It's what I came out of school having learned. I don't know if any of the teachers said it. I suspect they did. I suspect it was in all the texts. I suspect it was in a lot of examples and a lot of sermons we were exposed to. And it just outraged me so much. I was lost. I spent an entire winter wondering if I could continue as a rabbi, knowing, every week, every Shabbos, I would officiate at another family's little boy growing up, and my son would never grow up. I even worried if I can go on as a believing Jew, because this was just so wrong if God could do this to me. What saved me, I read a sermon given by Archibald MacLeish about his play J.B., in which he said essentially that the one thing God needs from human beings is their love and forgiveness for all the unfair things that happen in the world. And then I run across a passage in the Talmud, and this absolutely blew my mind. When it talks about the sacrificial offerings that were brought on the Sabbath and on the new moon, I think it's in Book of Numbers chapter 28, it says, "You shall bring a sin offering for the Lord." It is the only time in the Torah when the words sin offering for the Lord occur, and one of the rabbis in the Talmud says it's a sin offering on God's behalf. God wants to atone and apologize for all the unfairness of life. And at that point, a light bulb went on in my head, just like you see in the comic books. And I said, aha, this didn't happen as part of God's plan. God is as offended by this as I am. God is as pained by this as I am. And that was the great breakthrough. God is on my side, and the two of us are facing this together. God is with us. God is with Aaron. He is not inflicting this on my son. And that helped me come to terms with the fact that Aaron would not live very long. God did not send this. This is biology, and biology is blind, and biology is cruel sometimes. The same sort of biology which will put the gene for breast cancer in a woman. And that God's role is not to distribute reward and punishment. God's role is to instill in us the capacity to take whatever life deals to us. When my wife told him that he didn't have long to live, like many children who find out they're going to die young, he was afraid he would be forgotten because he didn't live long enough to achieve anything. Children don't realize that parents never forget the child they lost. And that was when I promised him that afterward, when the time came, I would try and tell his story to the world. So I wrote When Bad Things Happen to Good People, partly to keep a promise to my son, and partly because the theological solution that I came up with, that if I have to choose between an all-powerful God who is not kind and fair, or a kind and fair God who is awesomely powerful but not totally powerful, I would affirm God's goodness and compromise his power, rather than the other way around. I use that in sermons, I use it in eulogies, I use it in comforting mourners, and I thought if I could get it out there, a lot of people could benefit from this. Never dreamed to become an international bestseller. To this day, I have trouble believing it happened. In fact, the book was turned down by 2 commercial publishers before Schocken took it. But, what worked for me, worked for all these other people. I remember the day I began to think I really had something there. The book had just come out. Schocken, small publishing house, nobody heard of them, nobody ever heard of me. They sent me on a publicity tour for anybody to turn on a microphone in front of me. I was flying into Houston to do a couple of radio call-in shows. As the plane landed, I'm saying to myself, why are they sending me here? This is Houston, it's the buckle of the Bible Belt, this is evangelical country. I just hope I get out of town alive. I went on a radio show, and I had Baptist women call in and say, Rabbi, thank you so much for writing this book and telling us that God loves us. He's not punishing us. And I had preachers call in and say, Rabbi, thank you for writing this. I can give it to a congregant who's grieving, and he or she can read it when they're ready for it. and I began to think there was something there. Then the book came out in October, caused a very small ripple at the time. February hit the New York Times list, and it stayed there for a year and a half. But I do not believe, and I cannot believe, that Aaron's illness and death was part of God's plan for me to write this book and bring people, millions of people, back to God.
Okay.
I'm not interested in serving a God who plays games like that. Secondly, what I am proudest of is not just that I have helped literally millions of people all over the world come to terms with their tragedies, but that the world is learning about the essence of God from a conservative rabbi. And this has got to be good for the Jews.
Okay. Harold, is God a person?
No, God is not a person. There is no word to describe God except God. When I pray to God, when I think about God, when I write about God, I conceive of God as a person, and I immediately remind myself that that's my shortcoming. That's my limitation. I can't get my head around the idea that God he's not a person, but he's not an impersonal force. People ask me, is God personal? And I say, yes, if you let me explain what I mean by personal. I don't think God is an old man with a beard who lives in the sky and listens to our prayers. I think, as Maimonides wrote a long time ago, references to the hand of God, the eyes of God, the ears of God are all metaphorical. God is personal in this sense. Some forces in the world are impersonal. Gravity has the same effect on every human being, on every object, irrespective of who they are. Heat and cold affect everybody and every object the same. They are impersonal forces. But then there are forces which are personal. Love, courage, resilience. These vary from person to person. I see God first as the source of the stability in the world. That, the world is an orderly place. I can calculate when the sun will rise and set 50 years from now on a given date. But God is also the source of the personal qualities. He gives people courage. He gives people resilience.
And I'm sorry, what does that mean to you? When you say God gives courage, forgive me for pressing, what do you really mean?
I do not believe that God wrapped up an essence of courage and sent it to me as a birthday present. What I mean is something like this. Had someone said to my wife and myself on New Year's Day 1963, before this year is out, you will have a child with the following problems, and this is what it'll mean to your family, and this is what it'll mean to your marriage, and this is what it'll mean to your job. Can you handle it? I suspect on New Year's Day 1963, my wife and I would have said, please don't test us. We know our limits. That's more than you can really realistically ask of us. But as happens to all of us, Aaron came into our life without our permission being asked first. And from somewhere which I cannot otherwise identify, my wife and I found within ourselves qualities we would have sworn we did not have. And I don't know how to explain where they came from. Mm-hmm. It's the same experience I have when I sit down to write a book. Mm-hmm. And I say to myself, I've got to try and make this clear. I know what the problem is. I know what scares people. I know what oppresses people. Where is the answer? And all of a sudden I realize I know the answer. It's not a question of remembering. Mm-hmm. It's a question of realizing I know something that I didn't know. Where did that insight come from? For me, this is the experience of Ruach HaKodesh, of the Holy Spirit entering into me.
When you say that,
yes,
who knows how Harold and Suzette were blessed with whatever enabled them to deal with their son Aaron the way they did. But are you suggesting that it didn't happen, it wasn't there to begin with, and that God somehow, did implant it in you after Aaron came? Or are you saying that somehow there is in the human being something from God which emerges as a result of the situation you found yourself in, but that it is not something which God determined to give to Harold Kushner, which he did not decide to give to somebody in a house down the block?
The only answer I can give you, Mark, is I don't know.
Is that true, though? You don't know?
I really don't know. I'm inclined to think it's the latter, that it was latent in me
Latent
and in
in
my
you,
wife,
yes.
and would never have emerged if circumstances had not called it forth, and that another family might not have been able to come up with the same qualities. Although my experience since Aaron died and since my book came out, we have met a number of other families who have children with progeria. And to an astonishing degree, they have responded even as we have. We've heard stories about families who were so embarrassed they would not let their children out of the house, would not send them to school. But the ones we've met respond as heroically as we did. What the analogy that comes to mind is all these gifted African American athletes who know how to throw a basketball through a hoop from 15 feet away. If they had not been born in the United States, they never would have found out they have that ability. Maybe it's something like that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I was born in the United States. I keep trying. I can't do that with a basketball. So there are capacities that some people are born with that the circumstances of their lives either lead them to develop or they remain latent. It's Gray's Elegy in a Country Graveyard.
At some point, when you learn of Aaron's illness, do you blame God?
In the beginning I did, because that was the theological paradigm I'd inherited.
You know, there are times when people have a beloved who is ill, and they ask God to heal their beloved. Does God heal beloveds?
I'm inclined to make a distinction between healing and curing. Curing means making a problem go away. Healing means giving a person the resources to cope with a problem that isn't going away. Yeah.
That's very beautiful, Howard.
I think, I'll tell you the story of how I came to this insight.
Please.
I was doing an interfaith radio program one day, and I was introduced to the Protestant member of the panel who told me he was pleased to meet me. He was an evangelical, and he just had a healing service for people with AIDS, and they was a reading from my book. I hear him say, healing service, evangelical, and I say to myself, oh boy, I've got an Oral Roberts on my hands here. So I said to him somewhat sarcastically, oh, I didn't know you could cure AIDS with prayer. And he said, well, of course not. We weren't curing anything, we were healing. Healing the relationship between the person with AIDS and his family. Healing the relationship between the person with AIDS and the most important person in his life who's moved out of town and doesn't return his phone calls. And I realized that was the distinction. I think God makes it possible for people to heal. How? He sends them doctors and nurses to take care of them, to give them the sense that you matter and we want to help you feel better. He surrounds them with people who will visit them in the hospital, and that we know from experiments that makes people feel better. And even late at night when they make everybody go home and they turn the lights off, God's role is to assure the very sick person that he or she is not in that hospital room alone. That's how God heals. Now, if prayers for the sick were either always heard or heard on the basis of merit, a lot of people would live forever. The fact is, people die. Good people die. Virtuous people die. People who are needed die. God's role is not to keep them alive. God's role is not to decide who shall live and who shall die. And yeah, I want to get to the Yom Kippur prayer in just a moment. God's role is to make sure that when life treats us harshly, we don't feel that it's because of our unworthiness and that we have been abandoned by God.
Say that again. When things happen that are difficult, we're not to feel what?
Not to feel that God is punishing or rejecting us. Not to feel unworthy. Because I think the danger of taking the traditional idea that God understands this is part of a large picture and God knows what's good for you better than you do, I think that steals from the suffering person his right to feel outraged. I think there is something very legitimate about being angry at what's happened to you. And it is not a sign of piety to just bow your head and say, God's will be done.
Yes, but it's not about being angry at God. That's your insight.
Yeah. Well, I tell people, you're entitled to be angry at God because, you're angry. What are you, better than being angry at your spouse, better than being angry at the doctor, better than being angry at yourself for deserving it. So get the anger out of your system. I heard a brilliant lecture a couple of years ago by one of the most gifted teachers of Torah I've ever met, Aviva Zornberg, the Israeli Bible scholar, about, at the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy, Moses acts totally out of character. He complains about God not permitting him to enter into the promised land. He's never done anything like this before. Why does he do this? Zornberg's thesis, it's brilliant. He wants to give the Israelites permission to be angry at God. And they take advantage of it. You know, God hates us. Why? If you can't be angry, you can't love someone. Only after the Israelites are permitted to vent their anger at God, only then do you have the verse, the best known verse in the book of Deuteronomy. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your might. Before that, the Torah only speaks about obeying God, following God, honoring God, not loving. If you're afraid to express anger, you can't genuinely love. Your emotions are inauthentic.
What's it mean to love God, Harold?
I'm not sure what it means to love anybody. For me, to love God means to appreciate all the things that are in my life because of God. To realize how empty and pointless my life would be without these things. Whether it's a spring day, or the presence of people who care about me, or the fact that when I need to come up with certain abilities, they were there, from passing a math exam in public school to writing my most recent book. All these things that God has put there, my innate sense of right and wrong, the good feeling I get when I sit down at my desk in the morning and before I write a word, I write a check to tzedakah. Mm-hmm. These are all things that I experience because God is real, and I'm grateful for them.
We're rabbis. Very often you'll hear the line, why do bad things happen to good people? Why do the good die young? And there's one little thing that bothers me about that whole statement. Most people are good. And when people say, why do bad things happen to good people? It's as if what? They should happen to bad people? And my feeling is that most people are good, and that it's just tragic when any human being dies young, and that the truth is the insight I felt from your book when bad things happen to good people is it's really an inappropriate way of even stating the problem.
You're absolutely right. Mark, I have met so many people who gush over me and say, I loved your book, Why Bad Things Happen to Good People. And I have to tell them, I don't mean to be a nitpicker, I never wrote a book by that title. And it's not just nitpicking. The whole point of the book is that why is an inappropriate question. First, because why is a search for somebody to blame. Blame God, blame the doctor, blame your wife, blame the other driver, whatever. And a search for somebody to blame doesn't do anybody any good. This is not a court of law. And the second is why focuses on the past. And no matter how smart you are, or how pious you are, or how wealthy you are, you cannot change the past. The moving finger writes, and having writ moves on, or all thy piety wit, etc. So instead of looking at the past, ask, when bad things happen, what do I do now? In Hebrew, there are two words for why. Madua, which means from what cause, and lama, which means to what end. I don't want to know about what cause. Suppose we found out that Aaron had progeria because my wife drank too much Kiddush wine when she was pregnant. Suppose we found out that Aaron had progeria because we lived in a house near high-tension wires that emitted radiation. Does that make any difference? We still have this wonderful child who died at age 14. The question is, what do you do about it? It's the great insight I learned from Viktor Frankl in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. You cannot control what people do to you. You can always control how you respond to what happens to you.
So Harold, who were your mother and father? And to what extent do you feel in some way they have helped you be who you are?
My parents were both born in Europe, in Lithuania. And I drive my wife crazy when I tell her that the Lithuanians are the intellectual elite of European Jewry.
What were their names?
Julius and Sarah Hartman Kushner. My father went to a Haskalah gymnasium, a Hebrew-speaking gymnasium in Lithuania, worked in Palestine, pre-state Israel for a year, came to this country, My mother came here as a very young child and went to school here. My mother went to the Jewish Theological Seminary's Teachers Institute.
Really?
She was a student of Mordecai Kaplan in the 20s, as I was in the 50s. My father was a very active officer at the Brooklyn Jewish Center, which was, in its time, the outstanding conservative congregation in the country. So I grew up with this strong connection to Judaism, to Jewish learning, to conservative Judaism, and the legend of Mordecai Kaplan.
Okay. You were at JTS, though, I believe, when both Kaplan and Heschel were there.
That's right.
Did you find yourself drawn to one more than the other?
Totally. At the time, this is the mid-50s, the student body was sharply divided between the Kaplan and the Heschel disciples, with not a whole lot of dialogue going on between us. I look back on that with embarrassment. I was totally Kaplanian. The older I get, the more I've come to appreciate what Heschel was trying to do. It was really, it was unfair and unworthy of us to dismiss him just because Kaplan spoke to us, and the same thing from the other side, to dismiss Kaplan because people responded to Heschel. My closest friend in the Rabbinic is a disciple of Professor Heschel, Jack Reamer. And we've both come to appreciate the truth and the wisdom of both these teachers.
Then I wouldn't be insulting you by telling you that I feel that in some way Harold Kushner is a synthesis of Kaplan and Heschel.
Mark, that is the nicest thing that anyone said to me in a long time.
You have two of the greatest thinkers of the second half of the 20th century. One, Kaplan, a sort of naturalist, and one, Heschel, and I don't know if this is fair to say he's simply a mystic, but he certainly stressed the spiritual side of the relationship between God and man and the Jewish people, and how do you read the Torah. And what you have done is you have brought in very many ways the best of Kaplan and the best of Heschel. You have taken a very wonderful worldview and given it soul. And if there's any criticism of Kaplan is, as brilliant as he was, and you understand as much as anyone how so many of the styles of Jewish life we live now, even within the Orthodox world, are a reflection of Kaplan's insights. But he was never able to somehow bring the soul of the Shekhinah into the discussion of his teaching. And what you have done, it was where I was going to ask you next, is the extent to which you have an intellectual, philosophical, very cogent approach that, in my mind, is filled with the Shekhinah. Do you know what I mean by that?
I know all too well, and I'm very gratified and very flattered by the comment.
And I want you to talk for a moment about whether the rabbinic concept of the Shekhinah, the presence of the divine among us, this poetic notion that the Shekhinah walks at the right hand of every human being, whether that in fact speaks to you, or whether it is, you appreciate my saying it, but that no, it is not something that ever has permeated the conscious thought of Harold Kushner.
Let me say that the mystical dimension of Judaism is an acquired taste for me, and one that I did not come to naturally. Also, I must pay tribute to how I broke out of that Kaplanian intellectual shell. It was my son Aaron. He compelled me to love and to cry and to reach out and to humanize the abstraction that I inherited from Dr. Kaplan. Beyond that, late in life, I have come to appreciate the mystical side of things. I've come to appreciate that there are things I simply cannot comprehend and will never understand, but they are every bit as real as the things that make sense to me. I don't come to it easily. I am Lithuanian, but there's a growing appreciation of why this speaks to so many people and why I cannot ignore it.
So your newest book is Overcoming Life's Disappointments. And one of the things the book does, it's not the only thing, it draws upon the character of Moses. So speak for a moment about how does that, at what point do you get this insight that the character who, in the Torah, has the right in some way to be most disappointed with the storyline is Moses, and then what are you trying to say to us about disappointment in our own lives?
I think I built my book around the story of Moses because for me he represents, as you said, the person who didn't get everything he deserved in life and ends up blessing the people who've been driving him crazy and blessing God for putting him in that position. And I think he becomes a role model for us. I started with that, and then the astonishing thing is, the more I wrote about different forms of disappointment in yourself, in others, the more I found that the story of Moses fits into that so perfectly. I think that what I need to learn, what we all need to learn from Moses, is how to fail and not feel like a failure. How to fail and keep on going because you have your eye on the goal.
Mm-hmm. What's his biggest disappointment, Moses, in the text?
Oh, there are two. The large-scale one, that he wanted to make the Israelites a special people, and they insisted on being ordinary, the golden calf. And the personal one, he wanted to spend his last days in the Promised Land, and for an infraction which strikes us as, at best, minor, he is denied that right, and he has to come to terms with it.
To what extent does the midrashic reading of the text influence you? You sit down to write a book, and you're trying in some way to find in the text a message that will help the people who read your book. Are you doing this stam? You come simply as an individual who opens up the page, and whatever the page says, it jumps out at you? Or when you read, when Harold Kushner reads the Akedah, do you hear the rabbi's own grappling with the text? When you hear the story of Moses, do some of the midrashic discussions about Moses arguing with God, I want to be the one who never dies, let me live forever, or Moses arguing with God on Sinai, no, I don't want to go down and stand with the rest of the people, I want to stand with you when the Torah is given? To what extent do midrashic insights play with you as you write? To what extent is this Harold Kushner coming to the text and not worrying about a rabbinic tradition that stands behind the text?
Mark, even if I wanted to approach it with a clean slate, just as Harold Kushner reading a text, the way I might write a secondary source on Herodotus' history or something, I can't. I was a pulpit rabbi for 30 years. I spent 8 years writing the Eitz Chaim commentary on the Torah. I cannot read the text as if I had not immersed myself in Midrash. I read it vertically through all the generations of commenting on it. I don't always follow it. I have a lot of trouble with for example, the rabbinic interpretations of the Akedah, the story of the command to sacrifice Isaac. But I'm aware of them. And I start with that and figure out what do I do with it. And the same thing with all the legends about Moses. There is this wonderful passage at the very end of Deuteronomy where Moses says, I'd love to enter the land of Israel. God says, you can't. You're the wrong leader. They need a younger, more vigorous warrior. And then Moses says, well, I don't have to go in as a leader. Let me go in as a follower. I can be leader emeritus. And God says, okay, try it. The first day Joshua goes into the tent of meeting to encounter God, comes out, Moses says, how'd it go? What did God say to you? Joshua says, excuse me, when you would go into the tent of meeting, did you ever tell me what God said? At that point, Moses turns to God and says, take me now. I don't want to spend the rest of my life being jealous of my successor. That is such an important story.
That's a gorgeous story.
For me personally, for every middle-aged man to read.
So as we sit together today, it's almost 50 years in the rabbinate for you.
Right.
We've discussed for a moment the fact that you came out of JTS at really what was perhaps its most exciting time. The 50s and the 60s and Kaplan and Heschel. When you look at contemporary Jewish life in America today, do you worry for the Jewish community?
Yes, I do. On the one hand, I would not want to go back to a world where gifted Jews ended up as Hebrew school teachers instead of professors of English in the Ivy League because that's all that was available to them. I would not want to go back to a world where we lived in a very circumscribed environment. But I understand the challenge of getting people to take their Jewishness seriously when so many other options are available to them. And I know that we're losing some very good people simply because the gravitational pull of the American, Gentile, quasi-Christian, secular way of life is so strong. What it means is rabbis have to work harder. I cherish something that Franz Rosenzweig wrote in the 1920s when he said, Jewish education in the future will start with people's questions, not Judaism's answers. I came out of seminary in 1960, chock full of answers, and found out those answers did not fit my congregants' questions. And it was a lengthy, difficult process of re-education to start listening to what their questions really were, and to go back and find the values in the books I'd been exposed to that responded to their questions. And it was a real challenge.
Do you find that today's rabbis understand what you've said better than your contemporaries did?
Some do and some don't. There are rabbis who are much better at listening than at speaking, and that's to their credit. The old-style rabbi knew how to speak better than he knew how to listen, and I'm glad we've left that behind. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there's a very interesting phenomenon going on, Mark, of people who came to the interest in the rabbinate late in life, not so much because they wanted to be rabbis, but because they wanted to be observant Jews. And their understanding of Judaism is one that simply does not work for the average synagogue goer. And that creates a chasm between the rabbi and the congregant, which they have a lot of difficulty bridging. They just speak a different language than the congregant does, because they did not grow up in a congregation, and that I think is problematic. But the seminary is much, much better now at preparing people to be congregational rabbis than in my day.
Because?
Because they realize we need it. Mm-hmm. The assumption used to be if you know enough Talmud, you know how to be a rabbi.
And now what's the assumption?
If you love Jews and you love Judaism, you will work out the shidduch.
I feel I am sitting with a rabbi who really got it and who really loves Jews. And not only Jews, you love everybody. And that's the gift you've given to us through your writing. It's not simply simple answers. And again, I hope people take your writing seriously and understand that you're not trying to do a how-to book or one of these self-help books. You're really trying to open up for people possibilities of finding something in themselves that is really profound and touching. And again, I have such a high regard for what you've done, and it's been an honor for me to meet you. It's been an honor for me to, for you to let me probe you the way I have. You're very, very gracious. Harold Kushner, I hope this is only the first of many times we put a semicolon, not a period here. Kol tuva hatzlacha in everything you do. Mazal
Mark,
tov.
thank you so much.
And that was our meeting with Rabbi Harold Kushner. I hope you enjoyed hearing the things he had to say about life and the Jewish tradition. Of course, as always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts you may have to what Harold has said. Please write me at rabbigalub@shalomtv.com. And if you'd like to be in touch with Harold Kushner, you can do so by writing to me, and anything you want to send to him, I'll make sure he sees. And so until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.